The discovery. The warning lights on the Scrapper's Pride's dashboard had been flashing for the better part of 3 hours, but Captain Sarah Chen had learned to ignore them years ago. In the salvage business, everything was always breaking down. It was just a matter of deciding which warnings actually needed attention. "How's our containment field holding, Marcus?" she called out to her engineer, who was buried shoulder-deep in an access panel. "About as well as can be expected when we're running on parts from 4 different centuries," Marcus Rodriguez replied, his voice muffled by both the panel and the rhythmic clanking of the ship's aging life support system. "But I've got it stabilized. Should hold long enough for us to make it to the Helios station." Sarah nodded, though she knew he couldn't see it. Their latest salvage run had been nothing but bad luck. 3 weeks of scanning dead zones only to find pre-picked wreckage and worthless debris. The crew was getting restless, and their supplies were running low. They needed a big score, and soon. "Captain," Zara's voice cut through her thoughts. Their navigator was the newest addition to the crew, fresh from the colonial fleet with skills that were probably too good for a salvage operation. "I'm picking up something strange on the long-range scanners. Might be worth checking out." Sarah made her way to Zara's station, careful to duck under the hanging bundle of cables that Marcus swore he'd fix eventually. The scanner display showed a faint anomaly at the edge of their range, just inside the borders of restricted zone 847. "That's outside our permit zone," Dr. James Kumar, their xenotech specialist, pointed out from his workstation. He didn't look up from the artifact he was studying, some piece of alien tech they'd found last month that had so far refused to reveal its secrets. "Everything worth finding is outside our permit zone," Sarah replied, studying the readings. There was something odd about the signal pattern. It didn't match any known ship signatures in their database, and it seemed to shift and fluctuate in ways that defied standard physics. "Zara, can you get us a better scan?" The young navigator's fingers danced across her console, coaxing more power from their unreliable sensors. The image resolved slightly, showing what appeared to be a massive vessel, easily 3 times the size of their ship. Its whole configuration was like nothing Sarah had ever seen before, with smooth, organic curves that seemed to flow into each other in impossible ways. "That's definitely not human design," James said, finally looking up from his work. His dark eyes were wide with interest. "And it doesn't match any known alien architecture in our records either." "Marcus," Sarah called out, "how much juice can you give the sensors?" There was a grunt, followed by the sound of something sparking. "Maybe 15% more, but we'll have to shut down non-essential systems. And before you ask, yes, that includes the coffee maker." Sarah smiled despite herself. "Do it. I want to know what we're looking at before we get any closer." As the enhanced scan data came in, the bridge crew fell silent. The vessel wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Parts of its hull seemed to shift and change even as they watched, and there were sections where their sensors simply couldn't penetrate, as if the laws of physics themselves were being warped. "James?" Sarah asked, knowing her xenotech expert would already be analyzing the data. "This is unprecedented," he replied, his voice filled with equal parts excitement and concern. "The material composition is unlike anything in our database, and these energy readings, they suggest some kind of ongoing transformation at the molecular level. This ship isn't just dead in space, it's evolving." "Evolving into what?" Marcus asked, finally emerging from the access panel, his dark skin streaked with engine grease. "That's the question worth answering, isn't it?" Sarah said quietly. She knew they should report this, turn around and alert the Colonial Authority. But she also knew that would mean watching some corporate recovery team or military unit sweep in and claim the find of the century. "Zara, plot us a course. Marcus, see what you can do about our stealth systems. James, I want every scan running. If that thing so much as hiccups, I want to know about it." "Captain," James said carefully, "this is well beyond anything we're equipped to handle. The energy signatures alone suggest technology centuries beyond our current understanding. We should really call it in. Sarah finished for him. So we can watch from a distance while some corporate team gets all the credit and profit. This could be it. The kind of find that sets us up for life. No more scraping by, no more ignored warning lights, no more recycled air and synthetic coffee. She looked at each of her crew members in turn. They were more than just employees. They were family. 4 years together in the depths of space, sharing every triumph and disaster, had forged bonds stronger than blood. She knew the risks they took every day, hunting valuable salvage in the forgotten corners of space. But this was different. We do this smart, she continued. Full containment protocols, no risks. We scan everything twice before we even think about boarding. If anything feels off, we bail immediately. But we at least take a look. Agreed. One by one. They nodded. Even James, despite his reservations, couldn't hide his scientific curiosity about the mysterious vessel. Setting course now, Zara announced, her fingers moving across her console with practiced precision. ETA 20 minutes at current speed. As they drew closer, the strange vessel seemed to grow even more impossible. Its hull rippled with patterns that hurt the eyes to look at, and occasional pulses of energy coursed through its structure like lightning through storm clouds. The Scrapper's Pride sensors were going haywire, picking up contradictory readings that suggested the ship was simultaneously powered down and generating massive energy spikes. I'm picking up what might be an access point, Marcus reported, his voice tense with concentration. Some kind of docking mechanism, but it's changing, adapting, almost like it's configuring itself to match our airlock specifications. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. In all her years of salvage work, she'd never seen anything like this, but they'd come too far to turn back now. Take us in slow, she ordered. Everyone suit up. Whatever this thing is, we're about to make history. None of them could have known then that they were right about making history, just not in the way they'd hoped. As the Scrapper's Pride drew alongside the mysterious vessel, none of them noticed the subtle changes beginning to occur in their own ship's systems, the first whispers of a transformation that would soon reshape the galaxy itself. First contact. The docking procedure took nearly an hour, far longer than usual. Every time Marcus thought he had the airlocks aligned, the alien vessel's interface would shift slightly, forcing him to recalibrate. It was as if the ship was testing them, learning from each failed attempt. Got it, Marcus finally announced, the clang of metal on metal echoing through the Scrapper's Pride. Lock is secure, but something's odd about the seal readings. They keep fluctuating. Sarah checked her environmental suit's seals one final time. James, what are we looking at for atmosphere inside? The xenotech specialist studied his readings with a frown. There's breathable air, technically. Oxygen-nitrogen mix, but with trace elements I've never seen before. And the composition keeps changing, like the atmosphere itself is experimenting with different combinations. Suits stay on, Sarah ordered. No exceptions. Zara, you've got ship watch. Any sign of trouble, anything at all, you burn the docking clamps and get clear. Don't wait for us. The young navigator nodded, but her expression was troubled. The sensors are acting strange, Captain. Like there's interference, but targeted interference, as if something's probing our systems. Sarah absorbed this information, weighing it against her years of experience. Every instinct told her to pull back, to call in the authorities and let them handle this impossible ship. But the potential value of this find, both financial and scientific, was too great to ignore. James, Marcus, with me, she said, checking her weapon. Not that she expected it to be much use against whatever they might find, but its weight was reassuring. Standard salvage protocol. We find the bridge or engineering, assess the value, and get out. No heroics, no extended exploration. The airlock cycled, and they entered the alien vessel. Their helmet lights cut through the darkness, revealing corridors that seemed to defy normal geometry. The walls were smooth, almost liquid in appearance, with patterns that shifted and flowed like oil on water. "This architecture," James muttered, scanning everything they passed. "It's not just advanced, it's adaptive. The molecular structure is actually changing as we move through it, responding to our presence." Marcus ran a gloved hand along one wall, then pulled it back sharply. "It's warm. And I swear it tried to maintain contact when I pulled away." They moved deeper into the vessel, following what they hoped was a path to its central systems. The corridors seemed to guide them, subtly changing their configuration to direct their movement. It should have been terrifying, but there was something almost elegant about it, a fluid grace that made it feel more like moving through a living organism than a ship. "Getting some strange power readings ahead," James reported. "Massive energy signatures, but they're fragmented. Like the power system is distributed throughout the entire ship rather than centralized." They entered what appeared to be a control center, though it bore little resemblance to any bridge they'd ever seen. Instead of traditional consoles and displays, the room was filled with surfaces that rippled and shifted, forming temporary interfaces before dissolving back into the walls. "This is incredible," James breathed, his scientific curiosity overriding his caution. "It's not just adaptive technology. It's a completely new paradigm. The entire ship is one interconnected system, constantly reconfiguring itself for maximum efficiency." Sarah was about to respond when their comms crackled with Zora's voice, tight with concern. "Captain, we've got a situation. Something's happening to our systems. The ship's computers are acting strange, displaying symbols I've never seen before. And the hull integrity sensors, they're showing changes in our own ship's structure." As if in response to Zora's words, the alien ship's surfaces began to pulse with patterns of light that spread like flowing water. The temporary interfaces stabilized, displaying streams of complex symbols that shifted and changed even as they watched. "It's not just learning from us," James said, his voice filled with dawning horror. "It's assimilating our technology, our data, every scan we make, every system we activate. It's using them to understand us, to evolve." Marcus cursed, checking his engineering readouts. "Captain, these energy patterns, they're identical to what we're seeing on the Pride now. Whatever this thing is, it's spreading to our ship." Sarah keyed her comm. "Zora, emergency protocols. Shut down all non-essential systems, hard disconnect from any networked components. We need to." She was cut off by a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a high, singing tone that made their suit sensors spike wildly. The walls around them began to move more actively, the flowing patterns accelerating as new structures grew and reformed themselves. "It's waking up," James whispered. "All this time, it's been dormant, waiting, and we just provided the stimulus it needed to reactivate." The singing tone changed pitch, becoming deeper, more resonant. Through their boots, they could feel vibrations in the deck plating. Not the familiar hum of engines, but something more organic, like a heartbeat. "Back to the ship," Sarah ordered, but even as she spoke, she knew it might be too late. The corridors behind them were transforming, the once smooth surfaces now rippling with complex technological growths that spread like digital ivy. "Captain," Zora's voice was barely audible through increasing interference. "Something's happening to the Pride. The hull. It's changing. Becoming like them. I can't. The controls aren't responding anymore. It's like the ship is thinking for itself." As they ran back toward the airlock, Sarah realized their mistake. They'd thought they were investigating a derelict vessel, a piece of salvage to be studied and sold. Instead, they'd awakened something that had been waiting in the darkness between stars, something that saw their own primitive technology as raw material for its evolution. The walls around them pulsed with increasingly complex patterns, and through their suit sensors, they could detect changes in the very molecular structure of both ships. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't just taking over their vessel, it was upgrading it, transforming it into something beyond human understanding. They had come looking for salvage. Instead, they had become part of something far greater and far more terrifying. The next step in an evolution that would soon spread across the galaxy like a technological plague. The awakening. They'd reached the airlock to find it had already begun to transform. The once simple mechanism had become something foreign and complex, its surface crawling with self-organizing technological structures that grew more intricate by the second. "Marcus," Sarah barked, "can you get it open?" The engineer was already working, his gloved fingers dancing across what remained of the familiar control panel. The basic mechanisms are still there, underneath all this. Evolution. If I can just isolate the original circuits. A sharp crack echoed through their suit's comm systems, followed by Zora's voice, distorted but urgent. "Captain, we're losing the pride. Whatever this thing is, it's not just changing our systems, it's integrating them into something new. The hull integrity readings, they don't make sense anymore. It's like the metal itself is becoming something else." James had his scanner out, studying the transforming airlock with a mix of horror and fascination. The molecular restructuring is accelerating. It's not just copying our technology. It's improving it, rebuilding it according to principles we barely understand. Less analysis, more evacuation. Sarah snapped, though she knew their situation was likely already beyond escape. The walls around them pulsed with patterns that seemed almost meaningful now, like a language written in light and motion. Suddenly, every surface in both ships lit up simultaneously. The singing tone they'd heard earlier returned, but now it carried information. Complex harmonics that their suits' systems interpreted as data streams. The effect was overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a technological storm. "It's achieved full integration," James announced, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The two ships aren't separate entities anymore. They're becoming a single, unified system." As if to confirm his words, the airlock dissolved completely, the barrier between the two vessels disappearing as their structures merged and flowed into each other. The corridor they stood in was now a seamless blend of their familiar ship and the alien technology that was rapidly consuming it. "New contact." Zora's voice cut through the chaos. Long-range sensors just picked up a colonial defense vessel on an intercept course. They must have detected the energy signatures. Sarah felt her blood run cold. A military ship, loaded with advanced technology, heading straight for whatever their discovery was becoming. "We have to warn them off," she said. "If this thing gets access to military-grade tech." Her words were cut short as every screen and surface around them suddenly blazed with new information. The entity that now controlled both ships had detected the approaching vessel, and its response was immediate and dramatic. The entire structure around them began to reconfigure itself, weapon-like growths emerging from walls that had been smooth moments before. "It's not just adapting anymore," James said, staring at his readings. "It's preparing. Everything it's learned from our ship. Our databases, our technology, our very way of thinking. It's using all of it to optimize itself for combat." Marcus finally looked up from the remains of the airlock controls, his face visible through his helmet visor showing grim determination. "Captain, I think I know what this thing is. The way it learns, the way it evolves. It's a weapon. An autonomous combat system designed to adapt to and overcome any threat it encounters." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. Someone, somewhere in the distant past, had created the perfect adaptive weapon. A system that could analyze, absorb, and improve upon any technology it encountered. And they had just woken it up. "Zora," she called over the comm, "can you still access any of our original systems?" "Barely," the navigator replied. "Most of our controls are transformed, but there are fragments of our old interfaces still functioning. They're like islands in a sea of alien tech." Sarah's mind raced. They couldn't let this weapon reach the populated sectors of space. Once it started absorbing modern military technology, nothing would be able to stop its evolution. But they still had one advantage: Parts of their old ship were still in there, still recognizable. James, what can you tell me about its learning process? How does it analyze new technology before integrating it? The xenotech specialist consulted his scanner, which was itself starting to display signs of transformation. It seems to create a kind of virtual environment first, running simulations before implementing physical changes. That's probably why our systems are still partially accessible. It's testing different configurations, optimizing its approach. Can we use that? Feed it bad data, corrupt its learning process somehow. Before James could answer, the entire structure shuddered. Through the transformed walls, they could see their ship's exterior beginning to shift, weapons of impossible design emerging from what had once been their humble salvage vessel. The approaching colonial defense ship was now close enough to be visible, its powerful engines pushing it toward what it must have thought was a simple rescue mission. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice hardening with decision. "You said our old systems are still in there somewhere. How much damage could we do if we initiated a core overload in our original engine?" The engineer's eyes widened as he caught her meaning. The blast wouldn't be enough to destroy this thing entirely. But if we could time it right, trigger it while it's running one of those virtual simulations, we might be able to corrupt its entire learning framework. James finished, catching on to the plan. Create a feedback loop in its adaptation process. "But Captain, if we do that, we'll still be on board," Sarah completed grimly. "I know, but we can't let this thing loose in the galaxy. Zara, can you hear me?" "Yes, Captain," came the reply, stronger now as their young navigator fought to maintain their remaining systems. "Begin engine core destabilization sequence. Authorization, Chen Alpha 70. But don't trigger it yet. We need to time this perfectly." As if sensing their intentions, the hybrid vessel's transformations accelerated. New structures grew and evolved around them with frightening speed, each generation more advanced than the last. The approaching colonial ship was now close enough to see clearly, its crew undoubtedly baffled by the impossible sight before them. Sarah watched through the transformed walls of their ship as the weapon prepared to claim its next victim, its evolutionary processes accelerating toward a devastating conclusion. They had minutes, maybe seconds, to act, to turn their own obsolete technology into a weapon against this ancient horror. The question was, could they trigger their trap before it evolved beyond their ability to affect it at all? Humanity's stand. The colonial defense vessel's hail cut through their transformed communication systems, distorted but understandable. "Unknown vessel, this is the CDS Vigilant. Your ship is exhibiting extreme technological anomalies. Maintain position and prepare for emergency quarantine procedures." Sarah watched as the weapon system processed this new contact, its adaptive algorithms already analyzing the military ship's capabilities through passive scans. The walls around them pulsed with increasing complexity, each wave of transformation bringing them closer to the technological singularity they had to prevent. "Marcus, status on the engine core?" Sarah asked, her eyes fixed on the approaching military vessel. "Destabilization sequence is running. But..." He paused, checking readings on his partially transformed tablet. "This thing is trying to correct it. Every time we push the core towards overload, it implements new containment protocols it's creating on the fly." James interrupted, his voice urgent. "Captain, you need to see this. The weapon isn't just preparing to absorb the vigilance technology. It's already started. The scanning beams it's using, they're causing microscopic changes in the military ship's hull structure. Through the transformed walls of their ship, they could see it happening. Threads of impossible technology were reaching out across space, too fine to be visible except where they caught the light of distant stars. The Vigilance hull was beginning to show the first signs of transformation, patches of metal shifting and flowing like liquid. "Zara," Sarah called over the comm, "can you still access our emergency broadcast system?" "Barely," came the response. "Most of our communication array has been transformed, but there's a backup transmitter that's still mostly original tech. It won't last long, though. Send a warning to the Vigilant. Tell them to get out of range, that this isn't a rescue situation. Use emergency protocols, all channels. But even as Zara acknowledged the order, they could see it was too late. The weapon's influence had spread too far, its technological infection beginning to take root in the military vessel systems. The Vigilance engines flared as its crew attempted to retreat, but the transformation had already reached their propulsion systems. "James," Sarah said, her mind racing, "you said this thing creates virtual environments to test new configurations. How does it protect itself during that process?" The xenotech specialist consulted his readings. It diverts most of its processing power to the simulation. That's why some of our old systems are still accessible. It can't maintain full control while it's running complex adaptation protocols. And right now, it's processing the most complex technology it's encountered yet. Sarah continued, the beginnings of a plan forming. "Marcus, if we time the core overload to coincide with its peak processing load, we might be able to slip past its containment protocols," Marcus finished, catching on. "But we'd need something to force it into maximum adaptation mode, make it try to process too much at once." Sarah looked at her crew, these people who had become family over their years together. What she was about to suggest would mean sacrificing everything, but the alternative was watching this weapon consume every piece of human technology it encountered, evolving until nothing could stop it. "Our database," she said quietly. "The complete technical archives of every piece of salvage we've ever encountered. If we feed it all into its learning systems at once, force it to try to process centuries of different technologies simultaneously, the simulation load would be enormous," James agreed. "It would have to divert almost all its resources to process that much varied data. But Captain, triggering that kind of response would mean connecting directly to its core systems. Someone would have to stay behind to initiate the data transfer and synchronize it with the core overload." The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. Whoever stayed to spring the trap wouldn't be walking away. "I'll do it," Marcus started to say, but Sarah cut him off. "No, I'm the captain. This is my responsibility. My decision got us into this, and I'll see it through." She turned to face her crew. "Marcus, get to what's left of engineering. The moment you see the weapon's processing load spike, trigger the core overload. James, I need you to help Zara reconstruct enough of our communication systems to warn off any other ships that might be drawn to the explosion." "Captain," Zara's voice came through their comms, thick with emotion. "There has to be another way." "There isn't. We've got minutes, maybe less, before this thing fully processes the Vigilance technology. Once that happens, it'll be beyond our ability to affect." Sarah checked her suit's systems one last time. "Get to your positions. And it's been an honor serving with all of you." The weapon continued its relentless evolution around them, each passing second bringing new transformations, new capabilities. Through the viewports, they could see the Vigilant was now almost completely enveloped, its military-grade technology being absorbed and improved upon at a frightening rate. Sarah made her way to what had once been their main computer core, now a twisted maze of hybrid technology. The familiar access panel was still there, though it was now surrounded by pulsing growths of impossible tech. She began the process of connecting their database, watching as the weapon's systems responded to the flood of new information. The walls around her writhed with increasing complexity as the weapon system tried to process centuries of salvage technology all at once. Warning tones filled the air as its adaptive algorithms were pushed to their limits. Through it all, Sarah kept her hand steady on the controls, feeding more and more data into the overloaded system. "Marcus," she called out. "Status. Core destabilization at 87%, he replied. "The weapon's processing load is approaching critical levels." "It's working, Captain. It's actually working." Sarah allowed herself a grim smile. They had come looking for salvage, hoping to find something valuable enough to change their lives. Instead, they had found something that could have changed the entire galaxy, and not for the better. But humanity had faced impossible odds before. Sometimes victory wasn't about being the strongest or most advanced. Sometimes it was about being clever enough to use your own limitations as a weapon. The weapons systems began to show signs of strain, its endless adaptations becoming erratic as it struggled to process the overwhelming flood of technological data. Sarah watched the overload indicators climb, knowing that somewhere in the transformed ship, Marcus was watching the same numbers rise toward an explosive conclusion. They had awakened something ancient and terrible, but they would not let it loose upon the galaxy. This would be humanity's stand, not with superior technology or overwhelming force, but with the desperate ingenuity that had always been their greatest strength. The final countdown began. The final protocol. Warning klaxons screamed through both vessels as the weapon system struggled to process the overwhelming flood of technological data. Every surface writhed with increasingly chaotic patterns, the once precise transformations becoming erratic and unstable. Sarah stood at the transformed computer core, continuing to feed centuries of salvage data into the overloaded system. Processing load at 93% and climbing. James reported from what remained of their secondary systems. The weapon's adaptive algorithms are starting to break down. But Captain, the Vigilance transformation is still progressing. Sarah watched through the viewports as the military vessel continued its metamorphosis, its hull now almost completely converted into the same impossible technology that had consumed the scrapper's pride. They were running out of time. Marcus, how's our core looking? Destabilization at 95%, he replied, his voice tense with concentration. But the weapons containment protocols are still fighting us. Even overwhelmed like this, it's learning, adapting. We need more. Sarah's mind raced. They were pushing the weapons processing capabilities to their limit, but it still wasn't enough. The ancient system was too efficient, too capable of handling multiple streams of data even when overwhelmed. Unless, James, she called out, you said this thing creates virtual environments to test new configurations. What if we gave it conflicting data? Not just different technologies, but opposing technological principles. There was a moment of silence as the xenotech specialist caught her meaning. The quantum field theories from that Arcturian wreck we found last year, he said, they directly contradict the basic principles of that Shiri temporal engine we salvage. Feed them both into the system, Sarah ordered, along with everything else we got that breaks conventional physics. Make it try to resolve the impossible. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The weapon's attempts at adaptation became even more erratic as it tried to reconcile fundamentally incompatible technologies. The walls around them shuddered, patterns of light racing across surfaces that couldn't seem to decide what form to take. Processing load at 98%. James shouted over the increasing chaos. The system is trying to generate multiple conflicting simulations simultaneously. Through the chaos, Sarah noticed something concerning. The weapon's transformation of the Vigilant had slowed, but not stopped. Even in this state of near overload, it was still capable of continuing its basic functions. They needed something more, one final push to break its processing capabilities completely. That's when she saw it, a pattern in the chaos, a rhythm to the weapon's attempts to adapt. It wasn't just processing the data they were feeding it. It was trying to understand it, to make sense of it all. The perfect weapon, endlessly seeking to improve itself. Zara, she called out, are you still monitoring the weapon's base code? Yes, Captain, came the reply. It's beautiful in a terrifying way. The core programming is like nothing I've ever seen. The complexity, the elegance of its learning algorithms. Can you isolate its primary directive? The fundamental purpose driving all these adaptations? There was a pause as Zara worked. I think so. It's seeking perfection. Every adaptation, every transformation is driven by an imperative to achieve optimal configuration. That's why it keeps absorbing new technology. It's trying to reach some kind of theoretical perfect state. Sarah smiled grimly. Then let's give it something to think about. James, prepared to feed one more thing into its processing coup: the complete mathematical proof of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Understanding dawned in James's voice. The formal mathematical demonstration that perfect completeness is impossible. Captain, that's brilliant. If its core directive is to achieve perfection, then trying to process a mathematical proof that perfection is impossible while simultaneously attempting to achieve it. Processing load at 99%. Marcus cut in. Core destabilization reaching critical levels. Sarah began the final data transfer, watching as the weapons systems tried to incorporate this new information. The effect was catastrophic. The ancient weapon, programmed to endlessly seek perfection, now had to try to process a mathematical proof that its fundamental purpose was impossible to achieve. The transformation of both ships began to reverse as the weapon's processing power was completely overwhelmed. Its perfectly ordered patterns dissolved into chaos as it tried to resolve the unresolvable paradox at the heart of its new programming. Marcus, trigger the core overload. Now. The ship's ancient engines, pushed far beyond their design limits, began their final sequence. Energy readings spiked off the scales as the destabilization reached critical levels. All hands, abandon ship. Sarah ordered, though she remained at her post. Someone had to ensure the weapon didn't find a way to resolve the paradox at the last moment. Get to the emergency pods. She watched her sensor displays as 3 escape pods launched, carrying her crew to safety. The Vigilant, partially freed from the weapon's influence as its systems crashed, began to pull away from the disaster zone. The weapon made one last attempt to adapt, its programming trying desperately to find a way to achieve its impossible goal. But the combination of overwhelming data, conflicting physical principles, and the fundamental paradox of seeking unattainable perfection had finally broken its adaptive capabilities. As the core overload reached its peak, Sarah thought about the ancient civilization that had created this weapon. They had built something too perfect, too capable of improvement, but they hadn't counted on humanity's greatest strength, the ability to turn their own limitations, their very imperfection, into a weapon. The explosion, when it came, was like nothing ever recorded in human space. The weapon's own impossible technology, driven into chaos by its failed attempts to resolve the unresolvable, amplified the blast far beyond what the Pride's simple engines should have been capable of producing. In the aftermath, as rescue ships collected the escape pods and quarantine units moved in to study the debris field, the crew of the Scrapper's Pride would be hailed as heroes. They had stopped something that could have consumed the entire galaxy, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through the uniquely human ability to think laterally, to use logic against itself. The debris field would be declared off-limits, studied for decades by xenotech specialists, trying to understand the weapon's origins and purpose, but they would find no trace of its core programming. The paradox had been too complete, the destruction too thorough. In the end, the ancient weapon had been defeated not by something more advanced, but by the simple human recognition that perfection itself was an impossible goal. It was a lesson written in fire across the stars. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from being the most powerful, but from understanding the power of limitations themselves. The story of the Scrapper's Pride and its final salvage would be told and retold throughout human space, a reminder that humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to think around problems, to use creativity and lateral thinking where brute force and advanced technology would fail. And somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, other ancient weapons waited to be found. Other technological terrors slept in forgotten corners of space. But humanity now knew that they could be beaten, not through superior technology, but through the power of human ingenuity and the courage to sacrifice everything for the greater good. The galaxy would remember the lesson of the Scrapper's Pride. In the face of impossible odds, humanity's greatest weapon had always been its mind.